What's up, history buffs? Today, we're diving into the question nobody dares to ask. How did a bunch of priests end up running their own country right in the heart of Rome? Forget everything you think you know about the Catholic Church being just a religious organization, because the real story behind the Vatican's rise to power is way more twisted than any House of Cards episode you've binged. Smash that like button if you want the raw, unfiltered truth about how the Vatican played the ultimate long game, and let me know in the comments. Do you think religious leaders should have their own armies? Because, spoiler alert, they totally did. Picture this. It's 756 AD, and Rome is basically a hot mess. The mighty Roman Empire has crumbled faster than a stale cookie. Barbarians are running around like they own the place, and the Byzantine Empire is too busy dealing with its own drama to care about Italy. Into this chaos steps one man who's about to pull off the greatest real estate scam in human history. His name is Pope Stephen II, and this guy didn't just want to save souls, he wanted land, power, and his own personal kingdom. But here's the kicker. He was starting with basically nothing except a fancy hat and the ability to convince people that God was on his side. Now you might be thinking, how does a religious leader go from preaching about turning the other cheek to building an empire? Well, buckle up, because Stephen II was about to teach the world that sometimes you need to get your hands dirty to do God's work. And by dirty, I mean involving foreign armies, forged documents, and enough political manipulation to make Machiavelli weep tears of joy. The stage is set for the most audacious power grab in medieval history, and trust me, what happens next is going to blow your mind. This isn't just about religion. This is about how one institution managed to convince the world that it deserved to be both a spiritual authority and a temporal ruler, all while claiming divine mandate. Real talk. This next part involves more backstabbing and political scheming than a reality TV show, but with way higher stakes. We're talking about the birth of a theocratic state that would influence world politics for over 1,000 years. Hold up. Before we continue, drop a comment if you think religious leaders should ever command armies. Because Pope Stephen II was about to do exactly that, and his reasoning was, well, let's just say it was creative. So there's Stephen II sitting in Rome around 753 AD, and he's got a massive problem breathing down his neck. The Lombards, basically medieval Italian Vikings with anger management issues, are steamrolling through Italy like they're playing Risk on easy mode. Their king, Aistulf, has already conquered most of northern Italy and is now eyeing Rome like it's the last slice of pizza at a frat party. Now, traditionally, popes were supposed to look to the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople for protection. But here's the thing. Byzantium was about as useful as a chocolate teapot at this point. They were too busy fighting off Arabs and arguing about whether religious icons were evil to care about some barbarians causing trouble in Italy. Stephen II faced a choice that would define the next millennium of European history. He could either submit to Lombard rule and become just another religious figurehead under barbarian control, or he could do something absolutely revolutionary, find his own military patron. Plot twist incoming. Stephen decided to go full medieval diplomat and took a trip that would change everything. In 754 AD, this pope did something unprecedented. He crossed the Alps in winter to personally meet with Pepin the Short, king of the Franks. And guys, this wasn't just a friendly visit. This was a business meeting that would reshape the entire political landscape of Europe. Picture this scene. The most powerful religious figure in Western Christianity, traveling through frozen mountain passes, risking his life to meet with a Frankish king most people had barely heard of. It's like the Pope today flying to meet with some regional warlord, except this regional warlord happened to control the most effective military machine in medieval Europe. But here's where things get really wild. Stephen wasn't just asking for military help. He was offering something in return that no pope had ever offered before: legitimacy, divine legitimacy. The kind that turns a simple king into an emperor blessed by God himself. And Pepin? Well, he was about to learn that sometimes the best investments come from the most unexpected sources. All right, everyone. This is where our story takes a hard left turn into political genius territory. What happened between Pope Stephen II and Pepin the Short wasn't just diplomacy. It was the birth of a partnership that would literally reshape the map of Europe. Here's the deal they cut, and I want you to really appreciate how brilliant this was. Stephen offered to officially crown Pepin as King of the Franks with full papal blessing, giving him divine legitimacy that money can't buy. In exchange, Pepin would march his armies into Italy and crush the Lombards. Then, and here's the kicker, hand over conquered territories not to Byzantium, not to some local nobles, but directly to the Pope. Let me break this down for you because this is where the Vatican Empire actually begins. Stephen II wasn't just asking for protection. He was negotiating to become a temporal ruler with actual territory, actual subjects, and actual political power. This was like negotiating to become a sovereign nation, except doing it through divine authority rather than military conquest. Pause the video right now and guess what happens next. Because what Pepin agreed to was so unprecedented that it literally created a new type of political entity that had never existed before. In 754 AD, at the Abbey of Saint-Denis near Paris, Pope Stephen II placed the crown on Pepin's head and declared him King of the Franks by the grace of God and the gift of the Holy See. But more importantly, he also crowned Pepin's sons, including the future Charlemagne, as heirs to this divinely blessed dynasty. But the real genius move? Stephen also issued what historians call the Donation of Constantine, a document claiming that the first Christian emperor had granted the Pope temporal authority over Western Europe. Now here's the thing about this document. It was almost certainly a forgery, but in an age where literacy was rare and fact-checking was non-existent, who was going to argue with the Pope about ancient imperial decrees? This is medieval politics at its finest, folks. Stephen II had just convinced the most powerful military leader in Europe to not only protect the church, but to actively conquer territory specifically to create a papal state. And he did it all while claiming it was God's will and backed by ancient imperial authority. Real talk. This next part is going to sound absolutely bonkers. But stick with me, because Pepin actually followed through on this deal, and the results were more dramatic than anyone could have imagined. Buckle up, Buttercup, because Pepin the Short was about to prove that when Franks make a promise, they deliver with interest. And by interest, I mean overwhelming military superiority that would make the Lombards wish they'd stayed home. In 755 AD, Pepin crossed the Alps with a Frankish army that was basically the medieval equivalent of bringing a tank to a knife fight. The Lombards, who had been terrorizing Italy for decades, suddenly found themselves facing professional soldiers who fought like their lives depended on it because they literally did. King Aistulf of the Lombards took one look at this Frankish war machine and decided that maybe diplomacy wasn't such a bad idea after all. But here's where things get spicy. Pepin wasn't just there to push the Lombards back. He was there to fundamentally redraw the map of Italy. After crushing Lombard resistance faster than you can say divine intervention, Pepin did something that shocked the entire medieval world. Instead of keeping the conquered territories for himself or returning them to Byzantine control, he handed them directly to Pope Stephen II. This wasn't just a military victory, this was the creation of the Papal States, making the Pope both a spiritual leader and a secular ruler with his own kingdom. Hold up. Before we dive deeper, let me know in the comments if you think this was brilliant politics or a complete betrayal of religious principles. Because what happened next shows just how quickly spiritual leaders can adapt to wielding temporal power. The territories Pepin handed over weren't just symbolic. We're talking about a massive chunk of central Italy, including the Exarchate of Ravenna, the Duchy of Rome, and multiple strategic cities. The Pope had just become ruler of roughly 16,000 square miles of prime Italian real estate, complete with tax revenue, military obligations, and political authority over hundreds of thousands of subjects. But here's the really wild part. Stephen II immediately started acting like a secular ruler. He appointed governors, collected taxes, maintained armies, formed alliances, and even went to war against neighboring territories. The transformation from spiritual shepherd to medieval king happened so fast it would give you whiplash. And the justification? Divine mandate, baby. According to papal logic, God wanted the church to have temporal power to better serve its spiritual mission. It's like arguing that you need a Ferrari to better appreciate God's creation. Technically possible to justify, but we all know what's really going on here. If you're still with me, you're about to witness how this new papal kingdom became one of the most powerful political entities in medieval Europe, all while claiming to be above worldly concerns. Plot twist incoming. Just when you thought the Vatican's power grab couldn't get any more audacious, along comes Charlemagne, and this guy was about to turn the Papal States into the power broker of medieval Europe. Charles, who would later earn the title the Great, because medieval people loved their dramatic nicknames, inherited his father Pepin's kingdom and his alliance with the Pope. But unlike his dad, Charles had ambitions that stretched from the Atlantic to the Adriatic, and he saw the Vatican as the perfect partner for legitimizing his continental conquest spree. Here's where the Vatican played their cards so perfectly it's almost unfair. Pope Leo III, who took over this whole operation in 795 AD, found himself dealing with a Frankish king who was basically medieval Europe's version of Alexander the Great. And Leo? Well, he saw an opportunity to upgrade the Papal States from regional power to kingmaker of the Western world. Real talk. This next part involves political maneuvering so brilliant that modern politicians should take notes. Because what Leo III pulled off in the year 800 AD was the medieval equivalent of a hostile takeover of the entire concept of imperial authority. Christmas Day, 800 AD, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Charles is attending Mass, probably thinking about his next military campaign, when Pope Leo III does something that hadn't happened in over 300 years. He places an imperial crown on Charles's head and declares him Emperor of the Romans. Drop a comment right now if you realize what just happened here, because Leo III didn't just crown an emperor, he claimed the authority to create emperors. This was the Vatican essentially declaring that imperial authority comes not from military conquest, not from popular acclaim, but from papal approval. But here's the genius part. By crowning Charlemagne as Roman emperor, Leo III was simultaneously rejecting Byzantine claims to imperial authority and positioning the Pope as the ultimate kingmaker in Western Europe. Every future emperor would now need papal approval to claim legitimacy. And Charlemagne's reaction? Historians love to claim he was surprised or even upset by the crowning. But come on, this guy didn't accidentally show up at St. Peter's on Christmas Day without knowing what was about to happen. This was a coordinated power play that gave Charles imperial authority and gave Leo III the power to grant imperial authority. The Papal States weren't just a kingdom anymore, they were the source of imperial legitimacy in Western Europe. Not bad for an organization that started by preaching poverty and humility, right? And this is where our story takes another hard left turn into, holy crap, the Vatican learned how to play medieval Game of Thrones territory. Because once the Pope had his own kingdom and the power to crown emperors, the gloves came completely off. Throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, the Papal States became the Switzerland of medieval Italy. Except instead of being neutral, they were actively playing all sides to maximize their power and territory. Popes weren't just spiritual leaders anymore. They were political operators who could make or break kingdoms with their support. Take Pope John VIII, who ruled from 872 to 882. This guy was commanding armies, forming military alliances, and even personally leading troops into battle. When Arab raiders started threatening papal territory, John didn't just pray for divine intervention, he built a papal navy and fought naval battles to protect his coastline. Let me paint you a picture of how far the Vatican had traveled from its spiritual roots. Pope John VIII once excommunicated an entire kingdom because they wouldn't pay their taxes to the Papal States. Imagine getting a letter from the Pope that basically says, "Pay your bills or go to hell." Literally. But here's where things get really wild. The Papal States started expanding through the same methods every other medieval kingdom used. strategic marriages, military conquest, and political manipulation. Popes were arranging dynastic marriages for their nephews, conquering neighboring territories, and forming military alliances based purely on political advantage. Hold up. Before we continue, let me know in the comments if you think this transformation was inevitable or if the Church could have maintained purely spiritual authority. Because what happened next shows just how completely the Vatican had embraced temporal power. By the 10th century, the Papal States controlled not just central Italy, but held significant influence over kingdoms from England to Hungary. Every major political decision in Western Europe had to consider papal approval. The Vatican had become the ultimate political insider. They knew everyone's secrets, influenced every major appointment, and could swing the balance of power between kingdoms with a single papal bull. And the best part? They were doing all of this while claiming divine mandate. It's like building a business empire while insisting you're just following your religious calling. Technically true, but everyone knows what's really driving the decisions. If you're still with me, you're about to see how the Vatican took this political power and turned it into something even more impressive, a cultural and intellectual empire that would reshape European civilization. All right, folks, buckle up, because we're about to dive into how the Vatican didn't just build a political empire. They created a cultural and intellectual monopoly that makes modern tech giants look like amateur hour. By the 11th century, the Papal States had figured out something that most kingdoms missed. Real power doesn't just come from armies and territory, it comes from controlling information, education, and cultural narrative. And the Vatican? They were about to corner the market on all three. Here's the genius move they pulled. While other medieval rulers were focused on conquering more land, the Vatican built a network of monasteries, cathedrals, and schools throughout Europe that all answered directly to Rome. This wasn't just religious infrastructure. This was a continent-spanning organization with unified command, shared resources, and coordinated strategy. Think about this for a second. In an age where most kingdoms could barely control their own borders, the Vatican had operational authority from Ireland to Poland. Every bishop, every abbot, every monastery school was part of a unified system that could mobilize resources, spread information, and coordinate political action across the entire continent. But wait, it gets better. The Vatican also figured out how to make their expansion profitable through something called Peter's Pence, essentially a papal tax that every Christian kingdom was expected to pay. This wasn't charity, this was tribute. The Papal States were collecting revenue from kingdoms that could crush them militarily, and they did it by claiming divine authority. Real talk. This next part is going to sound absolutely bonkers, but the Vatican was running what was essentially a medieval multinational corporation. They had their own legal system, canon law, their own diplomatic corps, papal legates, their own intelligence network, confession, and their own military force, papal armies and crusading orders. Plot twist incoming. Pope Gregory VII, who ruled from 1073 to 1085, decided that even imperial power should be subordinate to papal authority. This guy literally forced the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV to stand barefoot in the snow for 3 days, begging for forgiveness. The Pope had just humiliated the most powerful secular ruler in Europe, and everyone got the message. The Vatican was now the supreme authority in Western civilization. And the craziest part? Gregory VII didn't just claim this authority, he backed it up. When Henry IV tried to depose him, Gregory excommunicated the emperor and released all his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. Suddenly, Henry found himself facing rebellions throughout his empire because the Pope had declared his rule illegitimate. This is medieval power politics at its absolute peak, folks. The Vatican had just proven that they could topple empires without fighting a single battle, simply by wielding spiritual authority as a political weapon. And this is where the Vatican's empire-building strategy reaches its absolute peak of audacious brilliance. Because Pope Urban II looked at the success of previous popes and thought, you know what we need? A way to project papal power beyond Europe while also solving our political problems at home. Enter the Crusades. And before you roll your eyes, hear me out on this, because what Urban II pulled off in 1095 was the medieval equivalent of launching a multinational military corporation while claiming it was all for spiritual reasons. Here's the genius of the crusading strategy. Urban II convinced the entire warrior class of Europe to abandon their local conflicts and march thousands of miles to fight under papal authority. This wasn't just religious fervor, this was the Vatican recruiting the most dangerous and ambitious men in Europe to expand papal influence into entirely new territories. Drop a comment right now if you realize what this meant for the Papal States, because Urban II had just figured out how to export European violence while importing wealth, territory, and political prestige. The First Crusade wasn't just a military campaign. It was a massive expansion of papal authority into the Eastern Mediterranean. When Jerusalem fell in 1099, it wasn't conquered for the Byzantine Empire or for any European kingdom. It was conquered under papal authority, with the Vatican claiming ultimate sovereignty over all Crusader territories. But here's where things get really spicy. The Crusader states became essentially franchises of papal power. The Vatican collected taxes from Crusader territories, appointed religious authorities throughout the conquered lands, and maintained political influence over every major decision from Antioch to Jerusalem. Let me break down what the Vatican had accomplished by 1100 AD. They controlled central Italy through the Papal States, influenced every major kingdom in Western Europe through their church hierarchy, collected tribute from Christian rulers across the continent, and now held territorial authority in the Holy Land itself. This wasn't just an empire. This was a transnational organization with religious, political, military, and economic authority spanning from Ireland to Jerusalem. The Vatican had achieved something that the Roman Empire at its peak couldn't maintain: unified authority over both Western Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. And the justification for all of this? Divine will, baby. According to papal logic, God wanted the church to have temporal power, political authority, military force, and territorial control because it made them more effective spiritual leaders. Real talk. What the Vatican accomplished between 756 and 1100 AD was one of the most successful empire-building strategies in human history, and they did it all while claiming they were just following their religious calling. Block 9. The money machine and papal banking. Buckle up, buttercup, because we're about to dive into how the Vatican didn't just build a political empire. They invented medieval capitalism and became the banking center of Europe. And trust me, this part of the story makes modern Wall Street look like a lemonade stand. By the 12th century, the Papal States had figured out something that most kingdoms missed. Controlling money is way more powerful than controlling armies. While other rulers were still thinking in terms of land and soldiers, the Vatican was building the first international financial system in European history. Here's how they pulled it off. The church had always collected tithes and donations, but now they systematized it into something resembling a modern tax collection agency. Every parish, every monastery, every cathedral was essentially a branch office collecting revenue that flowed directly to Rome. But wait, it gets better. The Vatican also controlled the pilgrimage industry, and pilgrimage was basically medieval tourism on steroids. Millions of people traveled hundreds of miles to visit holy sites, and every step of their journey generated revenue for church-controlled businesses. Real talk. This next part involves financial innovation that wouldn't look out of place in a modern business school textbook. The Vatican created letters of credit that allowed pilgrims to deposit money in their home country and withdraw it in Rome, essentially inventing international banking centuries before the Medici family got famous for it. Plot twist incoming. Pope Innocent III, who ruled from 1198 to 1216, took this financial system and weaponized it. This guy figured out how to use economic pressure to force political compliance from kingdoms across Europe. When King John of England refused to accept papal authority over church appointments, Innocent didn't send armies. He placed England under papal interdict, essentially shutting down all church services and cutting off the kingdom from the international Christian economy. No weddings, no baptisms, no trade partnerships with Christian merchants, no access to church-controlled credit systems. Hold up. Before we continue, drop a comment if you realize what this meant for papal power, because Innocent III had just proven that the Vatican could cripple entire kingdoms without fighting a single battle, simply by cutting them off from the Christian economic network. And it worked. King John eventually submitted to papal authority and agreed to hold England as a papal fief, essentially making the Vatican his feudal overlord. The Pope had just forced one of the most powerful kings in Europe to become his vassal through pure economic pressure. By 1200 AD, the Vatican wasn't just collecting tribute from European kingdoms, they were the central bank, the Supreme Court, the ultimate diplomatic authority, and the final arbiter of legitimacy for the entire Christian world. And this is where our story reaches its absolutely insane climax, because Pope Innocent III looked at everything previous popes had accomplished and decided it still wasn't enough. This guy was about to prove that the Vatican's empire could challenge the authority of every secular ruler in Europe simultaneously. Here's what Innocent III accomplished during his 18-year reign. He deposed the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV and replaced him with Frederick II. He forced King Philip Augustus of France to take back a wife he had divorced. He launched the Fourth Crusade that conquered Constantinople, and he established papal authority over kingdoms from Portugal to Hungary. Let me paint you a picture of peak papal power. By 1215 AD, every major political decision in Europe required papal approval. Want to get married as a king? Need papal permission? Want to go to war? Better make sure the Pope supports your cause? Want to trade with other Christian kingdoms? Hope you're not under papal sanctions? But here's the really wild part. Innocent III didn't just claim this authority, he systematized it. The Vatican, under his rule, became essentially the United Nations, the World Bank, and the Supreme Court of medieval Europe, all rolled into one institution. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 was basically the Vatican's declaration of victory over secular authority. This council established papal supremacy over all temporal rulers, codified canon law as superior to secular law, and created institutional mechanisms for enforcing papal authority throughout the Christian world. Drop a comment right now if you realize what the Vatican had accomplished, because by 1215 AD, they had achieved something unprecedented in human history. A transnational empire based on ideological authority rather than military conquest. Real talk. This next part is going to sound absolutely bonkers. But Innocent III actually claimed that the Pope held authority over non-Christian rulers as well, arguing that papal power derived directly from God and therefore applied to all earthly authority regardless of religion. The Vatican had gone from a besieged religious institution in 756 AD to the supreme authority over Western civilization in less than 500 years. They controlled territory from central Italy to the eastern Mediterranean, collected tribute from every Christian kingdom, influenced every major political appointment, controlled international trade networks, and claimed divine authority over all secular rulers. And the best part? They did it all while maintaining that they were just humble servants of God who reluctantly accepted temporal power only to better serve their spiritual mission. If you're still with me, you're about to see how this incredible empire eventually faced challenges that would test whether divine authority could overcome political reality. All right, everyone, this is where our story takes a dramatic turn, because even the most successful empire-building strategy eventually hits reality. And reality has a way of humbling even popes who claim divine authority. The Vatican's empire reached its peak under Innocent III, but his successors quickly discovered that maintaining transnational authority is way harder than establishing it. By the mid-13th century, the Papal States were facing challenges that would test whether spiritual authority could really overcome political and military power. Here's the first major crack in papal supremacy. Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor that Innocent III had helped put on the throne, turned out to be way more independent than expected. This guy looked at papal claims to supreme authority and basically said, "Thanks for the crown, but I'll run my empire myself." The conflict between Frederick II and Pope Gregory IX became the medieval equivalent of a constitutional crisis. Frederick argued that imperial authority came directly from God, not through papal mediation, while Gregory insisted that all temporal authority was subordinate to spiritual authority. Plot twist incoming. Frederick II didn't just argue his case, he backed it up with military force. When Gregory IX tried to depose him in 1227, Frederick responded by invading the Papal States and occupying territory within sight of Rome itself. Real talk. This next part shows how quickly divine authority can crumble when faced with professional armies and political determination. The Vatican's empire had been built on the assumption that secular rulers would always need papal legitimacy more than popes needed military protection. But Frederick II proved that a sufficiently powerful and determined ruler could simply ignore papal authority and face the consequences through military and political strength, rather than spiritual submission. Hold up. Before we dive deeper, let me know in the comments if you think the Vatican's empire was always doomed to face this kind of challenge, or if they could have maintained supremacy with different strategies. The conflict with Frederick II lasted for decades and basically broke the papal budget. Maintaining armies, fighting wars, and competing with imperial resources stretched the Vatican's financial system to its breaking point. By 1250, the Papal States were borrowing money from Italian bankers to fund their military campaigns. And here's the really devastating part for papal claims. Other European rulers were watching this conflict and learning that papal authority could be challenged successfully. The mystique of papal supremacy was evaporating faster than holy water in the desert. The Vatican was about to learn that empires built on ideological authority are only as strong as people's willingness to believe in that authority, and belief can be surprisingly fragile when faced with political alternatives. Block 12, the end of the Universal Empire. Buckle up for the finale, folks, because we're about to see how the Vatican's incredible empire finally met its match, not through military conquest or religious reformation, but through the rise of national identity and professional bureaucracy. By 1300, the political landscape of Europe had fundamentally changed. Kings like Philip IV of France and Edward I of England had built centralized monarchies with professional armies, efficient tax collection, and bureaucratic administration that could challenge papal authority on equal terms. The showdown came in 1296, when Pope Boniface VIII issued the bull Clericis Laicos, which forbade secular rulers from taxing church property without papal permission. This was the Vatican essentially trying to maintain their tax exemptions while everybody else was building modern states that needed revenue to function. Philip IV of France looked at this papal demand and basically said, "Hold my wine and watch this." Instead of submitting to papal authority like rulers had done for centuries, Philip banned the export of gold and silver from France, cutting off papal revenue from French sources. But here's where things get absolutely wild. Philip IV didn't stop at economic warfare. In 1303, he sent agents to arrest Pope Boniface VIII at his residence in Anagni, Italy. They literally kidnapped the Pope and held him prisoner until he agreed to rescind his claims to authority over French taxation. Drop a comment right now if you realize what this meant for the entire concept of papal supremacy. Because Philip IV had just proven that papal authority was only as strong as secular rulers allowed it to be. The aftermath was even more devastating for Vatican claims to universal authority. In 1309, political pressure forced the papal court to relocate from Rome to Avignon, where they remained under French influence for nearly 70 years. The institution that had claimed supreme authority over all earthly rulers was now essentially a client state of the French monarchy. Real talk. What happened between 1296 and 1377 was the complete collapse of the Vatican's transnational empire. The Papal States still existed, but their claims to supreme authority over secular rulers had been permanently shattered. But here's the ultimate plot twist. The Vatican's empire didn't really disappear, it just transformed. Instead of claiming universal political authority, the Church adapted by building cultural, educational, and economic influence that proved far more durable than political supremacy. So what do you think? Was the Vatican's medieval empire one of history's greatest success stories, or the ultimate example of mission creep gone completely out of control? Let me know in the comments below. The hidden truth about how the Vatican took Rome and built its own empire is that they pulled off the greatest institutional transformation in human history, going from a persecuted religious minority to the supreme authority over Western civilization in just a few centuries, then adapting when that supremacy became unsustainable. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more crazy stuff in medieval history that schools never teach you. Smash that like button if you want more stories about how religious institutions became political powerhouses, and hit subscribe because we're just getting started with the wild side of history that textbooks love to skip.